There is a version of you that used to believe things would be different. Not naively, not blindly. You were never the kind of person who trusted without reason, but somewhere inside, beneath the realism you've learned to wear, there was a fire, a sense of what things could be. What you could be, what the people around you could rise toward if only the conditions were right. You didn't call it idealism, you just called it caring. And then slowly, the world taught you what caring costs. You got passed over, overlooked, exhausted by trying to hold standards no one else seemed to share. You watched people who cared less advance faster. You saw sincerity mistaken for weakness. You learned, or told yourself you learned, that the world rewards adaptability, not vision, pragmatism, not principle. So you adapted. The question this episode doesn't rush to answer is, what did that cost you? There was a person, we'll call them the architect, not of buildings, but of systems. They worked in a mid-sized organization, the kind where the mission statement on the wall and the decisions made in the conference room had long stopped resembling each other. When they started, they believed in the work, not the company exactly, but the possibility inside it. They could see the gap between what the organization said it was and what it could actually become. And for a while, that gap felt like an invitation. They wrote proposals. They stayed late. They raised concerns in meetings with the kind of careful, reasoned energy that comes from genuinely believing someone is listening. Some of it worked, small things, marginal improvements, enough to keep the belief alive. But the years accumulated, and so did the moments, the memo that was ignored, the idea quietly attributed to someone else, the promotion that went to the person who knew when to stay silent. Each one small, each one alone, survivable. Together, they became an education. So the architect adjusted, learned to soften the language, learned to read the room before speaking, learned which battles to pick and gradually which battles weren't worth having at all. They became effective, respected even. People described them as practical, level-headed, a realist. And on most mornings, sitting in traffic on the way to a job they could perform with their eyes closed, they didn't think about any of this. But on other mornings, the ones that came less often but hit harder, they had a strange sensation, like catching a glimpse of a room they used to live in, a version of themselves that cared about things they no longer had the energy to name. They weren't depressed, they weren't bitter, they were simply quieter than they used to be, and they weren't entirely sure when the quiet had arrived or whether it had been invited. One voice says, "This is what growing up looks like." You cannot run on idealism forever. The world is not a place that rewards purity of intention. It rewards results, leverage, and the ability to move within systems that don't care what you believe. The person who holds the room isn't the one with the sharpest vision. It's the one who understands how ideas have to be packaged before other people can receive them. You learned that. It took years and it cost something, but you learned it. And that learning kept you employed. It kept you relevant. It kept you from being the person everyone quietly pities, the one who still talks about what things should be like while the room moves on without them. The other voice doesn't argue with any of that. It simply says, "But you used to feel something." Not euphoria, not the bright, uncomplicated optimism of someone who hasn't yet been disappointed. Something quieter and more durable than that, a sense of direction. A feeling that the work had weight because you understood why you were doing it. Like the distance between where you were and where you were trying to go was charged with meaning. Not comfortable necessarily, but alive. The first voice responds evenly. That feeling was a luxury. And luxuries are the first things to go when the environment stops supporting them. You adapted. That's not a failure, that's survival. You chose to stay functional over staying naive, and there's nothing wrong with that. The second voice is quiet for a moment. Then it asks something that doesn't have a clean answer. If it was just a luxury, why does its absence feel like a loss? Not a dramatic loss, not grief in any recognizable form, more like the way a room feels different after someone moves a piece of furniture you'd stopped noticing. You can't name what's changed, but something in the proportion is off. Something that used to orient you is gone, and now the room is just a room. Neither voice wins. They don't need to. They have been running this conversation in the background for years, in the margins of long meetings, in the shower on Monday mornings, in the 2 minutes before sleep arrives, and it has never once reached a resolution. It just reaches fatigue. And the fatigue itself becomes its own kind of answer. Not a good one, just the one that keeps showing up. The mind is very careful about how it narrates what happened. It does not say, "I gave up." That would be too direct, too exposed, too easy for something to push back against. Instead, it says, "I matured. I learned how things actually work. I stopped spending energy on battles I couldn't win. I became someone who understands the difference between what matters and what's just noise. I chose sustainability over spectacle." And all of that is true, partially. The way that a scar is true, accurate as a record, but incomplete as a story. Because a scar tells you that something healed. It doesn't tell you what the wound cost while it was still open. What the narrative leaves out is the moment of choice. Or more precisely, the series of small moments that together functioned as a choice, each one entirely sensible in isolation, each one a degree of turn away from something that had once felt essential. No single decision looks like abandonment, but looked at across a span of years, the direction of travel becomes harder to deny. There is a particular comfort in believing that pragmatism is wisdom. That detachment is perspective. That the quiet you've arrived at is the quiet of someone who has been through things, not the quiet of someone who has learned to avoid them. And that comfort is not entirely false. Experience does produce a kind of steadiness, and steadiness has value. But underneath the comfort is something that doesn't fully settle. A low-grade unease that surfaces at odd hours and doesn't respond to the usual defenses. Because the defenses were built for a specific kind of threat, the threat of failure, of embarrassment, of caring too much in a world that doesn't care back. They were built carefully over years, and they work exactly as intended. What they weren't built to handle is the question that eventually arrives anyway. Was this who you meant to become? Not, should you have done things differently? That question has 1,000 reasonable answers, and the mind is good at producing them. The harder question is quieter. It doesn't ask about strategy or choices or what you could have done. It just sits with what you actually feel when you stop moving long enough to feel anything. And what you feel, if you let yourself, is that the version of yourself that once cared about things cared for a reason. That the reason didn't disappear when the caring became inconvenient. It just got buried under enough sensible decisions that you stopped being able to find it easily. The mind moves quickly past that. It has had a lot of practice, and the speed with which it moves is, itself, a kind of data. Things that have truly been resolved don't require that kind of urgency. You don't need to look away from something that no longer holds any charge. The fact that the question gets skipped so efficiently, so automatically, says more about its weight than any answer could. Niccolò Machiavelli wrote in a world that punished idealism openly and without apology. His Florence was not a place where vision was celebrated for its own sake. It was a place where power moved through calculation, reputation was a resource to be managed, and the person who could not read that reality was eventually destroyed by it. And so Machiavelli wrote honestly about what survival required. He documented with unusual precision how effective leaders adapted, how they wore different faces in different rooms, how they knew when principle was a liability and when it could be deployed as a tool, how the appearance of virtue often mattered more than virtue itself. He described a world where the idealist was not wrong, exactly, just outmatched, just insufficiently equipped for the terrain. People read this and called him cynical. The word Machiavellian became shorthand for a particular kind of coldness, manipulation dressed as pragmatism, self-interest dressed as strategy. But that reading misses something important. Machiavelli was not celebrating the loss of idealism. He was describing, with unflinching honesty, what happened to people who lived in permanent conflict between what they believed and what the world rewarded. He documented the gap between the world as it is and the world as it ought to be, what he called the effectual truth of things against the imagination of them, and he wrote from inside that gap, not from above it. There is grief embedded in his clearest observations, even when the prose is calm. What he understood, and what is easy to miss when reading him as a manual rather than as a document of human tension, is that the cost of perpetual adaptation is not only exhaustion. It is something more interior. When you learn to suppress the part of yourself that holds a standard, that insists the world should be a certain way, that you should be a certain way, you do not simply become pragmatic. You become, gradually and without a clear moment of transition, a person who can no longer easily locate what they care about. The prince in Machiavelli's account was effective, strategically sound, capable of moving through the world without being destroyed by it. He was also, in Machiavelli's own telling, profoundly alone. Not because he lacked relationships, but because the version of himself capable of unguarded connection had been systematically retired in the service of survival. That loneliness was not a moral failure. It was not a character flaw. It was simply the price of a particular kind of competence, the competence of someone who has learned to function in a world that doesn't reward wholeness. Machiavelli saw this clearly. He wrote it down, and he did not pretend it was anything other than what it was. Something shifts when you see it through that lens. Not a sudden clarity, not the kind of realization that reorganizes everything at once. More like a slow adjustment of light in a room you've been sitting in for a long time. Nothing moves, but the shadows fall differently, and you begin to see the shape of things you had been navigating by feel. The architect who has been called practical, level-headed, strategic, a realist, begins to wonder quietly whether those words are descriptions or concessions. Whether being known for pragmatism has become a way of not being asked what they actually want. Whether the competence they've built has served, in part, as a kind of armor that outlasted the specific threats it was constructed for. Because the world that taught the architect to be careful was real, the disappointments were real, the cost of caring loudly in a room that wasn't listening was real. None of that was imagined, and none of it was irrational to learn from. But something else was also real, the version of themselves that existed before the carefulness arrived. That version was not naive in the way the first internal voice described. It was oriented. It knew what direction felt like. It understood, without needing to articulate it, why the work mattered, not because it was told to feel that way, but because it did. The adaptation solved something genuine. The vulnerability, the inefficiency of optimism in an environment that punished it, those were real problems, and the solutions that emerged were real solutions. But solutions have costs, and the costs were never quite named at the time. And unnamed costs have a way of collecting interest over years, accumulating quietly in the background until the total becomes difficult to ignore. The recognition that starts to form is not self-accusation. It is not the conclusion that everything was wrong, or that the adaptation was a mistake, or that there is someone to blame for how the years arranged themselves. It is something smaller and more honest than that. It is simply the awareness that somewhere in the process of becoming someone who could function, the architect set something down and then walked far enough away from it that they are no longer entirely sure where it is. Not lost, just not immediately findable. And the question of whether to go looking for it is one they have been avoiding without quite realizing they were avoiding it. There is a particular texture to that kind of avoidance. It doesn't feel like fear. It doesn't feel like anything dramatic at all. It feels like being busy, like having too much on the calendar to sit with an open-ended question that probably won't resolve neatly. It feels, most days, like being a functional adult in a world that rewards functionality, which is, in itself, a reasonable thing to be. But the avoidance and the functionality have become so intertwined that it is difficult to tell where one ends and the other begins. There is a difference between letting go of idealism and burying it. Letting go looks like integration. It means taking what you believed, the raw, sometimes impractical version of it, and passing it through experience until it arrives somewhere more honest. The fire doesn't go out, it steadies. It becomes something more useful than it was when it was only heat, only urgency, only the untempered conviction that things should be different. The person who lets go in this way doesn't lose their sense of direction. They refine it. They carry it differently, with less noise and with more precision. Burying it looks different. It looks like competence without direction, like effectiveness that has forgotten what it was originally in service of, like a life that functions, that genuinely, measurably functions, but that has quietly misplaced the thing that once made functioning feel like it mattered. The person who has buried their idealism is often very good at what they do. They are often well regarded. They are often, by most visible measures, doing fine. But they move through days with a faint and persistent sense that they are running a machine they no longer fully understand the purpose of. And the machine runs well. That is not nothing. But it is also not everything they thought it would be. Most people who bury their idealism do not do it in a single decisive moment. They do it the way the architect did, one reasonable adjustment at a time. Each individual choice a sensible response to a real circumstance. The adaptation was not reckless. It was not cowardly. It was, in the moment it was made, the right move. The accumulation is what no one warns you about. The way each small turn away from what you cared about adds to the ones before it, until the total distance between who you are and who you meant to be is significant in a way that no single step ever was. And the honest awareness, not the dramatic version of this, not the version that requires a crisis or a collapse to arrive, just the quiet, settled version that shows up in still moments, is this. The world does require adaptation. It always has. Machiavelli was right about that. The terrain of human life, of institutions and systems and other people's interests, does not bend simply because you would prefer it to. Adaptation is not weakness. Knowing how to move through the world as it actually is, rather than only as you wish it were, is a genuine form of intelligence. But adaptation is not the same as abandonment. The prince who learns to wear different faces in different rooms is still a person with a face. The question, the one that Machiavelli raised but did not resolve, because it is not the kind of question that resolves, is whether the person wearing those faces still knows, privately, which one is theirs. The cost of confusing adaptation with abandonment is not paid all at once. It is paid in the slow dimming of something that once oriented you, something that knew, without needing to be reminded, why any of this was worth doing. That is the real cost, not cynicism, not bitterness, not the dramatic disillusionment of someone who breaks under the weight of disappointment. Just the quiet, cumulative dimming of a light that used to tell you where you were going. Killing your idealism does not feel like a killing. It feels like wisdom, right up until you notice that the part of you which once knew what it wanted has grown very quiet. The real cost is not cynicism. It is the disappearance of direction. You do not have to go back. The person you were before the adaptation, younger, more exposed, less practiced in the art of managing your own expectations, that person is not waiting to be recovered. You have lived since then, changed in ways that were necessary and in ways that perhaps were not. Both are part of what you carry now, and that is not something to unravel. But there is a kind of inventory worth taking, not a dramatic reckoning, not a confrontation with everything you've become, just a slow, honest accounting of what you set down along the way, what you told yourself was letting go, what you filed under maturity. Some of it genuinely was. Experience is real, and what it teaches is real, and not everything you released deserved to be held onto. But some of it may still belong to you, not as nostalgia, not as a version of yourself you're trying to return to, but as something simpler. As the part of you that knows the difference between a life that functions and a life that has a direction. That can still locate, even faintly, what it actually cares about and why. Machiavelli lived in a world that punished vision openly, and he documented that world with a precision that still resonates centuries later, not because he celebrated it, but because he was honest about what it cost. He described the gap between the world as it is and the world as it ought to be without pretending the gap didn't exist, and without pretending that surviving it was the same as being unaffected by it. That honesty is worth something, not as a roadmap, not as a set of instructions for what to do next, just as a permission to see clearly, to acknowledge without drama or self-accusation what the years of careful adaptation have actually cost, and to decide from that place of clarity what you still want to carry forward. That is where this ends, not with answers, not with a direction to walk in, just with a little more light on the question and the space to sit with it honestly.